In Burkina Faso, the military-led government has detained 8 staff members of the Netherlands-based NGO, International NGO Safety Organization, on charges of espionage and treason.
It began quietly, another evening in Ouagadougou. But by nightfall, a storm had erupted. The Burkinabe government announced the arrest of 8 NGO workers, Europeans, Africans, all under one Western umbrella, accused of spying under the guise of humanitarian work. Burkina Faso called it espionage. The West called it a misunderstanding. But to Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government, it was something far more serious, a violation of national sovereignty wrapped in the language of charity. These arrests didn't just expose an NGO, they exposed an entire system. Security Minister Mohamedou Sanaa faced the cameras that night. His tone was firm, his words deliberate. They collected and passed on sensitive security information to foreign powers, he declared. No hesitation, no diplomatic sugarcoating. This wasn't about aid gone wrong. It was about the thin line between helping and watching, between humanitarianism and intelligence. The organization in question was the International NGO Safety Organization (INSO), a well-known European-based network that operates across conflict zones from Syria to Somalia, tracking incidents to guide aid workers. On the surface, their mission looked noble. But in the eyes of Burkina Faso's new leadership, their data had turned into something else, a map of national vulnerability. According to the government, INSO had already been banned from operating since July 31st, after being caught collecting security data without permission. Yet, the group allegedly continued working in secret, holding private meetings and storing sensitive information that should never have existed in the first place. When authorities finally moved in, they acted fast and quietly. 3 Europeans, 1 Malian and 4 Burkinabe citizens, including the country director, were detained. Inside their laptops and communications logs, officials say, were detailed maps of conflict zones, notes on armed group movements, and coordination reports. INSO called them safety assessments. But the government saw something far more dangerous: intelligence that could expose military strategies and weaken national defense. INSO denied the accusations, calling them categorically false. Their spokesperson told the BBC they were only in Burkina Faso for administrative purposes and had stopped all data collection after the suspension. But to the Burkinabe government, these denials sounded familiar. The same diplomatic script Africa has heard for decades every time Western institutions are caught overstepping boundaries. This wasn't just about 8 people. It was about power, knowledge, and control. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has been undergoing a political transformation, cutting ties with France, rejecting Western military partnerships, and reclaiming control over every inch of national security. The country has suffered years of insurgent attacks that, mysteriously, kept growing despite constant Western assistance. So for Traoré's government, this wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition that if foreign aid networks are mapping every attack, every convoy route, every ambush point, who else might be reading that data? And for whose benefit? When Minister Sanaa's announcement broke, the shock was immediate. Western embassies scrambled for explanations. Aid groups whispered of a new hostility. But inside Burkina Faso there was something else, a quiet pride. For decades, Africa had been watched, measured, and analyzed by outsiders. But that night, Burkina Faso turned the gaze back outward. It wasn't just a security operation. It was a symbolic act, a declaration that Africa would no longer tolerate helpers who operate like informants. Because if even humanitarian data can be weaponized, then the real war in Africa isn't for land, it's for information. When investigators raided INSO's offices, they didn't just find reports. They found a pattern repeated across the continent: maps marked with conflict zones, coded language describing local actors, logs of rural incidents. To most people, it looked harmless, just another humanitarian report. But to anyone who understands security, this was a strategic map. Each entry revealed more than it seemed, showing where militants move, where the army is weak, and which regions are unstable. That kind of intelligence in the wrong hands can cripple a nation's defense before a single bullet is fired. Burkina Faso decided enough was enough. But here's the uncomfortable truth: INSO is not alone. Nearly every international NGO operating in the Sahel collects data, some for logistics, others for analysis. But all of it creates a parallel surveillance network that often feeds back to Western capitals. They call it transparency, but it's control. And this system didn't begin under military governments. It began under democracy when foreign partners quietly embedded information-sharing protocols into aid contracts. That's how Africa's crises became Western datasets. When Captain Traoré's government cut that pipeline, it wasn't repression, it was revolution. To understand why, you have to look at history. When colonial empires ended, they didn't disappear, they adapted. Soldiers became researchers. Fortresses became NGOs. Empires of land turned into empires of data. The goal remained the same: to know Africa better than Africans themselves. That's why this case feels like déjà vu, colonialism reborn through spreadsheets. Instead of maps and muskets, the tools are surveys and humanitarian dashboards. Burkina Faso isn't just questioning one NGO, it's questioning an entire worldview. The belief that Western institutions must always have a clearer picture of Africa's security than Africa does. The shock in Europe wasn't about 8 detained workers. It was about the collapse of a network that gave Western agencies constant access to Sahel intelligence. For decades, everything from foreign aid to military policy has relied on NGO-generated data. Without it, embassies, analysts, and investors go blind. That's why the backlash came fast. Paris demanded answers, Brussels hinted at sanctions, Washington expressed concern. But beneath the outrage was fear that if Burkina Faso succeeds in cutting off the data stream, other African nations might follow. And they already are. Mali, Niger, and the Central African Republic have all begun tightening control over foreign NGOs accused of interference. Across the continent, a new pattern is forming, a collective awakening. Western media, of course, framed the move as repression. Human rights groups warned about shrinking humanitarian space. But behind the headlines, another story was unfolding. One about Africa reclaiming its own narrative. Because for too long, Africa's story has been written by outsiders. Every statistic, every crisis, every report filtered through foreign hands. Burkina Faso's rebellion is a demand for data sovereignty, the right to own, control, and interpret information collected within its borders. The West calls it paranoia. Africans call it protection, and here's the irony. The same Western countries criticizing Traoré's government have their own strict laws against unregistered foreign data collection. In the United States or France, unauthorized information gathering is treated as espionage. But when Africa enforces the same principle, it's labeled authoritarian. That double standard isn't accidental. It's structural. Because if Africa starts owning its own knowledge, the global hierarchy collapses. Who then will define Africa's needs? Who will justify foreign troops? Who will write the next stability report without African data? Burkina Faso has forced the world to confront those questions, and they're not comfortable ones. The implications go beyond borders. The Alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, is already planning to build a joint security and data-sharing framework. For the first time, intelligence will flow between African nations, not from Africa to Europe. Imagine African-led monitoring systems, African safety networks, African data stored on African servers. That's not isolationism. That's independence. It's a shift from dependency to self-definition, from being studied to becoming the authors. And this wave is spreading. Kenya is debating new digital sovereignty laws. South Africa is pushing for local data storage mandates. Even Mauritius now requires development agencies to host their servers inside the country. Across Africa, governments are beginning to audit foreign-funded projects and demand transparency from those who once demanded it from them. The West sees suspicion. Africa sees self-defense. Because for decades, aid has been the most polite form of control, a tool to monitor, predict, and sometimes manipulate nations that refuse to obey. But when the observer becomes the observed, the narrative flips and power shifts. That's why Burkina Faso's defiance is more than an arrest. It's a warning shot to the entire global system that if one small West African nation can say no to the world's most powerful networks and survive, others will too. And when that happens, the old colonial algorithm of data extraction and narrative control will finally begin to fail. Yet Traoré's challenge isn't just external. True sovereignty demands discipline, building secure data systems, training local analysts, and crafting laws that protect citizens without silencing truth. Burkina Faso isn't closing its doors, it's redefining who holds the keys. Because real independence isn't just about land or trade. It's about who owns the truth. For centuries, Africa's image was drawn by others, explorers, missionaries, colonizers, consultants. Now the continent is ready to paint its own reflection, Not perfect but honest. The arrest of 8 NGO workers was the spark. The real story is the fire it lit, a continental awakening. Africa is no longer the subject of reports. It's becoming the author of its own reality. The West is watching. But for once, Africa isn't performing. It's writing.